The Woman No One Sees All of Red Mesa is talking about the strangest wedding in the land's history. Colt Mercer, the richest and most fearsome man in the three counties, has rejected every beautiful girl from a prestigious family and instead chosen a woman the town considers non-existent. Why? What is it about this poor, quiet woman that makes the unstoppable man nod in agreement? Like and comment your city to let me know how far this story has progressed, and follow to the end, because the answer will change the way you see human value forever. The first thing most people noticed about Colt Mercer was his hands, not his face, though that was the kind of face that made women stop mid-sentence and forget what they'd been saying. Not his shoulders, though they were broad enough that doorframes in Red Mesa's older buildings gave him trouble. Not even the gun he wore low on his right hip, which he'd drawn exactly twice in public, and both times the matter had ended before anyone could properly describe what happened. No, it was the hands, scarred across the knuckles, calloused along every ridge of the palm, the kind of hands that had pulled fence posts out of frozen ground and dragged cattle back from ravines in the dark. They were the hands of a man who'd built something real, and when Colt Mercer set those hands on a table or folded them across his chest, or let them hang still at his sides, people got quiet without quite knowing why. He was 34 years old, owned 14,000 acres of the best grazing land in Red Mesa territory, and had turned down 8 marriage proposals, or rather, had turned away 8 families who'd brought their daughters to Sunday dinners and social gatherings with barely disguised intentions. The territory had been trying to figure him out for years. "He's too proud," said Eleanor Whitmore, whose daughter Cecily had spent 3 Sundays at the Mercer Ranch to no result. "That man thinks no woman is good enough for him." "He's peculiar," said Judge Harlan Pruitt, who had his own reasons for wanting the Mercer land tied to a politically useful family. "A man that age with that much property and no wife? Something's wrong with him." "He's smart," said old Pete Dunbar, who ran the feed store and had known Colt's father. "He's just smart enough to know the difference between what he wants and what everyone else wants for him. Those aren't the same thing, never have been." Most people didn't listen to Pete. Red Mesa territory sat in a wide basin between 2 mountain ranges, and the land had a way of sorting people into 2 categories: those it broke and those it made harder. The grass grew in clumps, and the soil ran shallow over limestone, and in dry years the creek beds turned to cracked clay that looked like old skin. But water ran beneath the surface in places a man could learn if he paid attention, and the ranches that had survived 3 generations were the ones whose owners had learned to read the land rather than fight it. Colt's grandfather had been the first. His father had expanded. Colt himself had spent 10 years after his father's death restructuring everything, selling marginal parcels, deepening 3 wells, restructuring the grazing rotation so the land never got chewed down to nothing. The ranch ran leaner than it looked from the outside, but it ran clean. And in a territory where half the operations were mortgaged to the eyebrows, that meant something. What it also meant was that Colt Mercer was the most eligible man in 3 counties, and that fact had made his social life an extended exercise in fending off people who wanted a piece of what he'd built. He'd gotten careful about it early. He'd learned to read the look, the way a father's eyes went calculating when they landed on him at a gathering, the way certain mothers steered their daughters into his path with the casualness of someone who'd practiced the move in a mirror. He wasn't cynical about it, exactly. He understood that people had families to protect and futures to secure, and that marriage had always been partly business in places like this. He just wasn't interested in being someone's transaction. What he wanted, if he was honest with himself, which he mostly was someone he could actually talk to. Someone whose opinions had been formed by experience rather than by what they thought he wanted to hear. Someone who'd been wrong about things and knew it and had adjusted accordingly. He hadn't found that in any of the women paraded in front of him, and he'd stopped pretending he had. Nick, Tessa Hale lived 2 miles east of town on a 40-acre homestead that her father had stopped maintaining about 3 years before he died. The house was sound. Her father had built it well, at least, but the fencing needed constant attention, and the barn roof had a soft spot she'd been nursing along with secondhand timber for 2 seasons. She kept 4 horses, a small flock of chickens, and a vegetable plot that she watered by hand from a cistern she'd dug herself the summer after the funeral. She was 29 years old, 5'4", with dark hair. She kept braided back because loose hair was impractical when you worked with your hands all day. Her face was unremarkable by the standards that Red Mesa applied to women's faces. No particular softness, no delicate coloring, nothing that made men turn around twice on the street. She had her father's square jaw and her mother's watchful eyes, and she rarely smiled at people she didn't trust, which in Red Mesa meant she rarely smiled in public. What she had was a reputation as the best saddle repair in the territory. She'd learned it from her father, who'd learned it from a Mexican craftsman who'd worked the Mercer Ranch 20 years back. The skill involved knowing leather the way a doctor knew bone, its grain and its weakness, and the way it responded to stress over time. Tessa had a gift for it, a kind of intuitive reading of materials that translated into work that lasted. Ranchers came from 40 miles out to bring her their damaged tack, and she was never short of work even when she was short of everything else. She didn't socialize much. This was partly circumstance. She worked long hours and had no particular taste for the kind of socializing Red Mesa offered, which mostly involved standing around in someone's parlor making conversation that went nowhere. But it was also partly choice. She'd learned early that people in towns like this sorted women into categories fast, and once you were sorted, that was mostly where you stayed. She'd been sorted into the category of forgettable, and she'd made a kind of peace with it by deciding the category didn't matter as long as she could keep the roof on and the work coming in. What she hadn't made peace with was the land. Her father had filed on the 40 acres with intentions he'd never quite gotten around to acting on. The soil was thinner than the Mercer ground to the west, but there was something in the drainage pattern she'd been studying for 2 years now. The way water moved through after a hard rain, the places where it pooled, the faint green lines in late summer that suggested subsurface moisture, where nothing obvious was happening on the surface. She'd been mapping it in a notebook, cross-referencing with some old survey maps she'd gotten from the Territorial Land Office, and building a theory about what was under there. She hadn't told anyone about the theory. In her experience, telling people in Red Mesa about half-formed ideas was an efficient way to have those ideas laughed into silence. She first spoke to Colt Mercer in April, 14 months before the drought changed everything. He'd come in with a saddle that needed more than the simple repair he described when he rode up. The tree was cracked under the leather, which meant it had to be rebuilt from the inside, which was 2 weeks' work minimum. "It's worse than you said," she told him, setting it on the workbench and pressing her fingers along the seat to feel the flex. "The tree's broken. You've been riding on this?" "Last 2 weeks. Horseback on a broken tree." She looked up at him. "That's how you end up on the ground in a bad way." He'd looked at the saddle the way a man looks at something he knows he should have dealt with sooner. "What's it take to fix it?" "Rebuild or replace. Rebuild's 2 weeks, but it'll hold better than new. Replace depends on what you want." "Rebuild it." She named her price. He didn't haggle, which she noted. Men who didn't haggle either had more money than they needed or more respect for craft than the average. Sometimes both. 2 weeks, she said. "Come back the 15th. He came back on the 14th. She had it done, because she'd worked ahead on it. Not for any particular reason, she'd just gotten interested in the problem. The broken tree had an unusual fracture pattern, diagonal rather than the usual lateral split, and she'd had to think carefully about how to reinforce it in a way that distributed the stress differently. She explained this to him while he ran his hands over the finished work, checking the stitching and the fit of the seat. "Why diagonal?" he asked. She hadn't expected that. Most men took the saddle and left. "Horse with an unusual gait," she said. "Or a rider who carries weight asymmetrically. Which is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Horse favors the left front. Had a wire injury 2 years back. Healed wrong. Then the repair's right, but it'll happen again if you keep riding that horse hard. You want to think about how you're loading the left stirrup." He looked at her steadily. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was the way people look at furniture, useful but not requiring actual attention. He looked at her like she'd said something that required actual processing. "You know horses too?" "I know how stress moves through materials," she said. "Horse, leather, wood. It's the same problem." He paid her, and he left, and she didn't see him again for 3 months. The drought came on slowly, the way the worst ones do. First, it was just a dry spring. Not unusual. Then the summer rains didn't arrive on schedule, and by August the creeks were running half normal, and the grass was curing too early, and ranchers were looking at their hay stores with the particular expression of people doing math they didn't like. By September, it was clear it was serious. The Red Mesa Creeks, the main surface water source for the eastern quarter of the territory, dropped to a trickle by October. Wells that had been reliable for 20 years started pulling sand. Ranchers who'd been watching their neighbors' operations with competitive wariness suddenly started showing up at each other's places to talk, which was how bad it was. Colt had prepared better than most. He'd deepened his wells and lined them properly, and his stored water was substantial. But even he could see that if the winter was dry, spring was going to be ugly. At a November gathering at the Pruitt Ranch, Judge Pruitt had called it, which meant it was part meeting and part performance, the assembled ranchers listened to various proposals about how to handle the crisis, most of which involved someone else doing something difficult. There was talk of approaching the territorial government for relief, which everyone knew would take too long to matter. There was talk of a cooperative water sharing agreement, which fell apart in 20 minutes because 3 families had competing claims to the same creek tributary. There was a suggestion from Wade Whitmore, Eleanor's husband, that the most practical solution was for the territory's major ranches to consolidate resources through marriage alliances that could pool water rights and capital. This suggestion was directed with the lack of subtlety unique to men who consider themselves too important to bother with subtlety, at Colt. "You've got the best water situation in the territory," Wade said, looking at him across the fire. "And you've got no family connection to anyone here. That's an inefficiency." "Is it?" Colt said. This was not a question. "My point is, this crisis would be a good time to think about—" "I know what your point is, Wade." Colt set down his glass. "You've been making the same point for 3 years through various intermediaries. The answer hasn't changed." The room went tight, the way rooms go when a man with resources makes it clear those resources aren't available for the taking. Wade's jaw hardened. Community survival, Colt said, requires people solving problems. I'm interested in solving the problem. I'm not interested in getting married to a water rights claim." He said it flat, without heat, which somehow made it worse. What nobody knew was that Colt had been thinking about Tessa Hale for most of that autumn. He'd ridden past her place in October, checking the eastern fence line of his property, and stopped at the ridge that overlooked her 40 acres. She'd been out on the back portion of the land, on foot, walking a slow grid pattern with something in her hand. He couldn't make out what from the distance, but the pattern was deliberate. She was measuring something, or mapping something, not wandering, working. He'd watched for 10 minutes before riding on, and then thought about it for 2 weeks before he understood what he'd seen. She was reading that land the same way he'd been reading his own land for 15 years. He went to see her in November, on the pretense of checking whether she could repair some harness straps he needed for the winter. The straps were fine. He'd actually inspected them the day before, and they were fine. But he brought them anyway. She was in the workshop when he arrived, working on a bridle by lamplight, even though it was early afternoon because the sky had gone the flat white of pre-storm. She looked up when he came in, then back at her work. "Mercer," she said. "Hale." He set the harness straps on the bench beside her. "When you have time." She picked up one of the straps and ran her thumb along the edge without stopping work on the bridle. "These are fine. Is that right?" She looked up at him. "They're fine. The stitching's tight and the leather's oiled properly." A pause. "You know they're fine." He pulled a stool from under the bench and sat down. This was, he would later think, either a bold move or an obvious one, depending on how you looked at it. Tessa Hale was not a woman who wasted time on social niceties with people she didn't know well, and sitting down without being invited was either going to be taken as an imposition or as a signal that he intended to be direct. She went back to the bridle. "What do you actually want, Mercer?" "I saw you walking your back 40 last month," he said. "Grid pattern. What were you looking for?" The hands on the bridle slowed almost imperceptibly. "What makes you think I was looking for something?" "Because you weren't wandering. You were working. And nobody works a grid pattern across land that thin unless they think there's something to find." She set the bridle down and looked at him properly for the first time since he'd come in. Whatever she saw seemed to run against her default assumptions about why men came to see her, because her expression shifted in a way that was hard to name. Not warmer exactly, but less armored. "Water," she said. "I think there's a subsurface flow. The drainage pattern after rain suggests it's moving northeast toward the limestone shelf. If I'm right about the formation, there's likely a significant aquifer below the clay layer." "How deep?" 80 feet, maybe 90. He was quiet. In Red Mesa territory, 80 feet was a serious well, but not impossible. And a new aquifer, untapped in the middle of a drought, was more than serious. "You've told anyone else about this?" he asked. "No." "Why not?" She looked at him like the question had a self-evident answer she was deciding whether to bother with. "Because I don't have money to test it. And because if I tell anyone here and I'm wrong, I'm the fool woman who thought she found water. And if I'm right and I've told people, then suddenly everyone has opinions about my land." He thought about that. It was the correct analysis of the social situation. More to the point, it was the analysis of someone who had thought carefully about the asymmetry of information and risk in a community where she had little leverage. "If you're right," he said, "that changes things for the whole Eastern Valley." "I know." "What would it take to test it?" "Drilling rig and an operator, $300 approximately." $300 was not nothing. It was not for Colt impossible, but it wasn't nothing. "Show me your maps," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment he understood that she was doing the same thing he'd been doing since he sat down, trying to read the actual situation behind the surface of the conversation. He stayed still and let her read. "All right," she said finally, and got up and went to the back of the workshop. She came back with a notebook, worn at the corners, and spread it open on the bench. The maps inside were hand-drawn but precise. She had a draftsman's eye, clean lines, and careful notation. She'd been at this for more than 2 years. The data was thorough in the way that only patience produces. He went through it slowly, asking questions when something wasn't clear, and she answered without the defensive hedging people use when they're not sure of their work. She was sure of her work. She'd just been sure of it alone, in a workshop at the edge of a town that didn't look at her. When he closed the notebook, he said, "You're right about the formation. You know geology?" "Enough. My father drilled 4 wells on this property. I know what the formations look like in this basin." She nodded once, not pleased in a satisfied way, more like a woman who'd been holding a weight for 2 years and had just been allowed to set it down briefly. "I'll fund the test well," he said, "in exchange for a water rights agreement if it produces." She considered this. 60-40, she said. "In my favor. It's my land." 55-45. "In your favor, and I drill and maintain the infrastructure." "Done," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it. They went back to being people in a workshop, the deal clean and concluded, no ceremony about it. He came back 3 more times in November and December, ostensibly to discuss the water project logistics. They talked about the project, and then they talked about other things. The drought conditions, the failures in how the territory managed its surface water, a disagreement she had with the way ranchers in the region thought about grazing rotation. She had opinions that were not the opinions of someone who'd formed them from other people's opinions. She'd thought her own way through problems, which meant she'd sometimes gotten things wrong and had to revise, and the revisions had stuck because they were hers. He drove back from her place after the December visit with a feeling he didn't immediately name, and then did. He was interested. Not in the abstract way he was interested in the water project or the geological problem. He was interested in the person across the workbench. He wanted to know what she'd say about things he hadn't asked her about yet. He wanted to know what happened to her face when she was working through something difficult, that slight tightening at the corner of her mouth that meant she was deciding something. He sat with this for a week, and then he told himself it was impractical, and then he sat with that for another week. And then he thought about Wade Whitmore's face in the Pruitt parlor when he'd said the answer hadn't changed, and he thought about the maps in the worn notebook, and he thought about Tessa Hale's hand coming across the workbench toward him without hesitation. A business deal between equals. And he thought, the hell with impractical. He asked her in January. Not on a special occasion. He came to the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon with the survey results from the geological assessment he'd paid an assayer to do. He'd wanted to confirm her analysis before saying anything. And he spread the papers on the bench and showed her she'd been right about the aquifer. 83 feet down, the assayer estimated. Good volume, good pressure. She looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. He could see what she was doing, running through the implications, what it meant for her land, what it meant for the territory, what it meant for her position in a community that had filed her under forgettable. "We'll need to move in spring," she said, "before the next dry season starts." "Agreed." He paused. "There's something else I want to say." She looked up. "I'd like to marry you," he said. The workshop was very quiet. Outside, the January wind was working at the barn door, and one of her horses shifted in the stall. "That's not what I expected you to say," she said. "I know. We've spoken 5 times. 6. I'm counting the saddle." She didn't smile at this, but something moved across her face. Why? It was, he thought, exactly the right question. Not the performative protest, "Oh, I'm not the sort of woman men marry," that convention suggested she should offer. Just the direct, practical why. "Because you're the most competent person I've talked to in 3 years," he said. "And because you say what you think, which almost nobody does. And because I'd like to know you better, and marriage seems like the most logical structure for that." "That's an unusual reason." "Probably." She looked at the survey papers. "I'm not what this town thinks a wife for you should look like." "I know. People will say I trapped you. They'll say it was the water. They'll make it ugly." "People will say things," he said. "They do that regardless." She was quiet for a long time. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the few things that came naturally to him, that ability to be still without the stillness becoming pressure. "I need to think about it," she said. "That's fair. Come back in a week." He came back in a week. She was waiting for him in the workshop doorway, and before he'd even dismounted, she said, "Yes, but I keep the water rights percentage regardless of what happens." "Of course," he said. "That was never in question." "I know," she said. "I just wanted it said plainly." "So did I." He got down from the horse. They stood in the cold morning light in front of a barn that needed a new roof, on 40 acres of thin soil over an aquifer nobody else knew about, and shook hands again, and then looked at each other, and something passed between them that was not exactly romance and not exactly business, and was probably the beginning of something they didn't have a word for yet. The announcement hit Red Mesa like a thrown stone hitting still water. The ripples went fast and ugly. "She's done something to him," Eleanor Whitmore said in her parlor to 3 women who nodded as fast as she could say it. "A man like Colt Mercer does not look at a woman like that unless she's done something." "What kind of something?" asked Della Pruitt, the judge's wife, whose interest was partly personal. She had a niece who'd been mentioned in connection with Colt twice. "I don't know what kind," Eleanor said, with the satisfied gravity of someone who'd decided the details weren't necessary. "But there's something." Wade Whitmore said it louder and to more people. "That woman has land that borders the Mercer property. That's what this is. Colt thinks he's being clever, acquiring that parcel through marriage. He's probably put her up to it." This version circulated rapidly because it allowed people to maintain their image of Colt as someone calculating and strategic rather than someone who'd simply made a choice they hadn't anticipated. Nobody considered or nobody wanted to consider, a simpler explanation. Tessa heard the talk because small towns are efficient delivery systems for things people say about you. She heard it from May Dunbar, Pete's daughter, who came in with a bridal repair and felt obligated to warn her. She heard it in the silences that opened up in the dry goods store when she came in. She heard it in the way the Whitmore girls looked past her at the well on a Wednesday morning, their eyes landing everywhere except where she was. She'd spent her adult life being treated as forgettable. This was different. This was being treated as a problem, which was its own strange feeling, worse in some ways, better in others. Being a problem meant people had finally noticed her. She didn't tell Colt about most of it. What would have been the point? He'd said people would say things. She'd agreed that they would. This was the thing they'd agreed on playing out exactly as predicted. And saying you were right, they're saying things wasn't useful information. What she didn't expect was Cecily Whitmore coming to the workshop on a Thursday afternoon in late January, alone, while her mother was at a quilting meeting 2 miles away. Cecily was 23 and beautiful in the soft, precise way of women who've been told their looks are their primary asset and have made an uneasy peace with this information. She stood in the workshop doorway with her hands folded in front of her and looked at Tessa with an expression that was trying to be dignified and mostly succeeding. "I need to say something to you," Cecily said. "All right," Tessa said. She kept working. She was mid-stitch on a girth strap because she'd found that keeping her hands busy made hard conversations easier to navigate. "Whatever you think you're getting," Cecily said, "it won't be what you think. Colt Mercer is not... he's not a man who..." She stopped. Started again. "My mother prepared me for 2 years. For 3 Sundays I sat in his house, and he was perfectly polite and perfectly cold, and I could tell every minute that I was just something to be gotten through until I left. You understand? He looked at me like I was a task he had to complete." Tessa set the awl down. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're making a mistake." The words came out more raw than Cecily had probably intended. "Or I made a mistake, and you're going to make the same one, and I don't know which." "You didn't make a mistake," Tessa said. "He just didn't want to marry you. Those aren't the same thing." Something in Cecily's face cracked slightly. "Then why does he want to marry you?" It was, Tessa thought, probably the most honest question she'd been asked in years. Not mean, genuinely confused. Cecily Whitmore had done everything she'd been told to do, and it hadn't worked. And here was a woman with calloused hands and a leaking barn roof who had apparently succeeded without trying. "I don't know," Tessa said, which was partly true. She had her theory, but it wasn't Cecily's business. "But I think you deserve better than 3 Sundays with a man who's just getting through your company, don't you?" Cecily looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back out into the cold without answering. Tessa watched her go, then picked up the awl and went back to the girth strap. They married in February with Pete Dunbar and May as witnesses, and a justice of the peace who had the grace to conduct the ceremony quickly and without commentary. No gathering, no celebration. The snow was coming down by the time they stepped outside, and Colt had the truck. He'd bought it secondhand the previous summer. And they drove out to the Mercer Ranch in the falling snow and went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. "Strange day," Tessa said. "Little bit," he agreed. She'd brought 2 crates and a worn leather satchel that held her notebooks. Everything else she'd left in the homestead house to deal with later. The homestead was still hers. She'd been clear about that in the arrangement, and he'd agreed without discussion. "Your kitchen's bigger than my whole workshop," she said, looking around. "I'll build you a proper workshop," he said. "Spring, when the ground softens." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I want to." It was a small thing. She filed it away anyway. That night she lay awake in the room he'd prepared for her, separate from his, which she'd noticed and appreciated, the consideration in it, and listened to a house that was too large and too quiet and smelled of wood smoke and pine and someone else's life. Outside the window the snow had stopped and the sky had gone clear, and through the frost on the glass the stars over Red Mesa burned cold and very bright. She thought about the aquifer under her 40 acres. She thought about the notebook in her satchel with 2 years of maps and observations and calculations that nobody had taken seriously. She thought about Cecily Whitmore asking, "Why does he want to marry you?" with that raw confusion in her voice, and about her own answer, "I don't know," and how it was only partly a lie. She knew some of why. She just didn't know all of why. And the part she didn't know was the part that mattered, and she'd married him anyway, because she was a practical woman who'd been alone in a leaking barn for 5 years, and she'd made a calculation, and the calculation had said yes, and she trusted her calculations. Outside, the stars burned on. Somewhere under 60 feet of clay and limestone in the patient dark, water moved. The drilling rig arrived on a Tuesday in early March, pulled by a team of 6 horses that churned the mud at the edge of Tessa's 40 acres into a dark mess that took 2 days to firm back up. The operator was a man named Gaspar Reyes, who'd sunk wells across 4 territories and had the permanently squinted expression of someone who'd spent decades looking into the ground trying to understand what it was hiding. He walked the property with Tessa for an hour before he touched a single piece of equipment. She showed him her maps. He studied them without speaking, turning the notebook sideways occasionally, and when he looked up, his expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something closer to actual interest. How long you been working this? 2 years. He looked back at the maps. You get any formal training? No. He handed the notebook back. Where'd you want to start? She pointed to the spot she'd marked in pencil 18 months ago, a location about 60 yards from the back fence line where the soil color changed in a way that was subtle enough most people would have walked over it 100 times without registering it. Gaspar looked at the spot, looked at the maps, looked at the spot again. All right, he said. Colt stayed out of it. He'd funded it and arranged for Gaspar, and then stepped back, which Tessa had noticed and not commented on. He had the particular discipline of a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was stay out of the way of someone who knew more than you did about a specific problem. He watched from the fence line on the first day. On the second day, he had ranch work that needed doing, and he did it. On the third day, Gaspar came to find him in the barn at 6 in the evening with mud up to his knees, and his squint loosened into something that was almost a smile. She was right, Gaspar said. 81 feet, good pressure, clean. Colt set down the harness he'd been hanging. Volume? Substantial, enough for both properties and then some. A pause. I've been drilling wells for 32 years. That woman read the land better than most licensed assayers I know. Colt said nothing, but he went and told Tessa himself, walking across to the workshop she'd taken over in the east end of the barn. Her workshop was already in progress, the promise from February being built out of lumber and intention by 2 hands and whatever time the days left over. And she was at the bench with a saddle, always at the bench with something. Gaspar says 81 feet, he said from the doorway. She didn't stop working, but something in her shoulders changed, a small release that she probably didn't know he could see from where he was standing. Good pressure? She asked. That's what he said. She set the saddle down. She looked at her hands, calloused, slightly stained with leather oil, and then out the barn window at the thin gray sky of early March. He couldn't see her face from the angle, just her profile, and what was on it was not triumph. It was something quieter and harder to name, the expression of someone whose private certainty had just been confirmed by the world after a very long wait. I need to start thinking about distribution, she said. If the pressure's right, we can run lines without a pump for the first several hundred yards. That changes the infrastructure cost significantly. I know, he said. She turned and looked at him. You've been thinking about it too. Since November. She almost smiled, not quite. You should have said something. It was your project, he said. I didn't want to crowd it. She studied him with that watchful, measuring look she had, the one that evaluated information rather than just received it. Come inside, she said. I've got maps. They spent 3 hours at the kitchen table that night with her notebook spread between them and a pot of coffee going cold on the stove, and it was the first time since February that the space between them felt like something other than 2 careful people trying to maintain appropriate distance in a large house. They disagreed twice, once about the routing of the main line, which she wanted to take along the property boundary and he thought should cut diagonal to save material, and once about depth on the secondary access point, where he had more practical experience from his own wells. Both times they argued it out flat and arrived at a position that incorporated parts of both views, which was, Tessa thought, a more productive outcome than she was used to with most disagreements. By 9 o'clock, they had a working plan on paper. She was rolling up the notebook when he said, "You should present this at the next ranchers' meeting." She looked up. "The water system, the distribution plan, you should be the one to present it. They won't want to hear it from me." "Some of them won't," he said. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't say it." She thought about this. "Wade Whitmore will make it about you. He'll say you put me up to it." "Wade Whitmore says things regardless. That's what he does." "It's not nothing, Colt. The way people receive information depends on who delivers it. You know that." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him running through it honestly rather than just defending his position. This was something she'd noticed about him in the weeks since February. He did that, actually stopped and processed rather than just doubling down. It was rare enough in men that she noticed it each time. "You're right about that," he said. "But if you let them decide who gets to speak before you've said a word, you've already lost the argument." She didn't have a counter to that because it was true. She just didn't particularly want to stand in front of a room full of people who'd already written their verdict on her and make them change their minds. It sounded exhausting. "We'll see," she said, which was not a yes and not a no, and he seemed to understand that and let it sit. The ranchers' meeting in April was at the Dunbar feed store, which had the largest interior space in town aside from the saloon and had better light. 14 men showed up, which was more than usual, and 3 wives who stood at the back and listened with the focused attention of people who know the real decisions get made after the meeting is over. Eleanor Whitmore was not among them, which Tessa found mildly surprising, then less so when she came in and saw Cecily sitting in the second row with her father. Eleanor's absence was a statement. Cecily's presence was Wade's attempt at pressure by other means. Put the injured party in view, make Colt uncomfortable, see if it moved anything. It didn't move anything. Colt sat next to Tessa at the front table, and if he registered the arrangement, nothing in his face said so. Pete Dunbar ran the meeting, which he did by asking blunt questions until people said what they meant, instead of what was polite. The drought status was grim. The Red Mesa Creek was at 1/3 of its normal flow. 2 smaller ranches in the northwest had already sold. 3 more were behind on their banknotes. "We need to talk about options," Pete said. "Real options, not government relief, which we all know means waiting until it doesn't matter anymore." Several voices at once. Wade Whitmore cut through them. "The practical option is resource consolidation. Water rights, acreage, capital. The ranches that can combine assets will survive. The ones that can't," he shrugged in the way of a man who's made peace with other people's misfortune, "will sell. That's how these things go." "Or," Tessa said, "we could use the water that's already there." The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone speaks who wasn't expected to speak. She didn't wait for the silence to become hostile. She put the notebook on the table, opened to the map of her 40 acres with the aquifer marked, and stood up. "There's a subsurface aquifer below my property," she said, 81 feet. "We confirmed it 3 weeks ago. The geological formation suggests it extends under the eastern valley, possibly as far as the Pruitt land to the northeast." She looked around the room. "I've been mapping this for 2 years. I want to share the data with anyone who wants to test their own property." The silence lasted about 4 more seconds, and then 6 people started talking at once. Wade Whitmore's voice came over the top of them. "You've confirmed this." "Confirmed and producing," Colt said from beside her. "Gaspar Reyes drilled it. Any of you who want his contact can get it from me." "The aquifer extends under our land." This was from Hector Salinas, a quiet man who ran cattle on the northern edge of the valley and had said almost nothing all meeting. "I believe so," Tessa said. "The data suggests the formation is broad, but it'll need to be tested on each property to confirm depth and pressure." More voices. Judge Pruitt, who'd been listening from his chair with his thumbs hooked in his vest, said, "What's the cost to drill?" Tessa named Gaspar's rate. Several people looked at each other in the calculating way of people who aren't sure if they can manage the number. "What about a collective approach?" Pete said. "We pool for one rig, drill across multiple properties, spread the cost." This was the practical suggestion that cut through the noise, and Tessa was grateful for it because it meant Pete had been listening ahead of the meeting. She looked at him, and he gave the minimal nod of a man who'd decided privately what needed to happen and was now executing. What she hadn't anticipated was Cecily Whitmore. In the middle of the discussion, with voices still bouncing around the room, Cecily stood up from her chair in the second row. Her father looked at her with the expression of a man whose plan is departing from the script. "I want to ask something," Cecily said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who's practiced being steady. "Mrs. Mercer, you've had this data for 2 years. Why didn't you bring it forward before?" It was not a hostile question. It was an honest one, and the room recognized it as such, because the noise dimmed. Tessa looked at her. Cecily's face was composed and serious, and there was something in it that Tessa recognized from the workshop doorway in January. That raw, unguarded quality beneath the surface performance. Because I didn't have the money to confirm it, Tessa said. And because nobody in this room would have listened to me before now. She said it without accusation, just as a statement of fact, and watched it move through the room and land in different places on different people's faces. Some faces hardened, a few softened. Most just looked uncomfortable in the way of people who know something's true and would prefer it weren't said aloud. Wade Whitmore said, "Let's stay on topic." "That is the topic," Pete said mildly. "How we use information and who we let bring it in." He looked at Tessa. "We're listening now. What's your distribution plan?" She talked for 20 minutes. She drew on the back of the notebook pages because she hadn't thought to bring a board. Hector Salinas asked detailed questions. Pete asked useful ones. Judge Pruitt asked 2 questions that were designed to understand the legal structure of the water rights, which Tessa answered precisely because she'd already thought through the legal structure. Wade asked no questions. He sat and listened with the expression of a man rearranging furniture in his head. Driving back from town, the road rough enough that the truck bounced in the ruts, Colt said, "You did well." "They still don't trust me," she said. "Some of them don't. Hector does. Pete always did. Pruitt's thinking about his land more than he's thinking about you, which means he'll be practical about it. And Wade's going to be a problem for a while longer," Colt said. "He's not used to being the one who missed something." She watched the land go past the window. It was evening now, and the light had gone that particular red that only happens in early spring on the high plains, everything the same color as old brick. "Cicely surprised me," she said. "She surprised me too. She's smarter than they give her credit for." She paused. "They've been preparing her to be useful in a very specific way, and it hasn't left a lot of room for anything else." Colt didn't say anything. She hadn't expected him to. It wasn't a question, just an observation. But after a moment he said, "Is that how you see yourself, the alternative version?" She thought about it. "I was never in line for what they were preparing her for, so I learned other things." A pause. "That's not the same as choosing." He nodded once, looking at the road. The ranch house came into view around the ridge, and she noticed not for the first time how solid it looked against the sky, how her father's house had always looked like something that might blow over, and this one looked like it had decided to stay. She wasn't sure yet whether she'd decided that too, but she was starting to learn the rooms, which was probably where it began. Inside, she went back to the workshop. She had 2 jobs waiting that she'd put off for the meeting, and she worked until the lamp oil got low and then set the awl down and sat in the dark for a minute, thinking. The aquifer was real. The water was there. She'd been right for 2 years in a room by herself, and now the room was larger and louder, and she was going to have to figure out how to be right in it without losing the thread of what she actually knew versus what people now wanted her to say. Outside, the wind had come up. Somewhere across the valley, another dry spring was deciding what it was going to do, and the land was waiting the way it always waited, patient and indifferent and full of things that hadn't been found yet. The collective drilling operation started in May and ran through June, and by the end of it, 4 additional properties in the Eastern Valley had confirmed aquifer access at depths ranging from 77 to 94 feet. Gaspar Reyes made more money in those 2 months than he'd made in the previous year, and he said so without embarrassment at the final site, standing in the mud of Hector Salinas's back pasture, watching the test flow run clean and strong into the collection ditch. "Best 2 months I've had in a long time," he said, to nobody in particular. Hector Salinas shook Tessa's hand. He was a quiet man who expressed things through action more than words, and the handshake was firm and held a beat longer than necessary, which was his version of a speech. The distribution infrastructure was harder. Running pipe across property lines required legal agreements between neighbors who'd spent years in low-grade competition, and some of those agreements took 3 drafts and a near fistfight between the Pruitt foreman and Wade Whitmore's eldest son before they got signed. Tessa drafted the technical specifications and let Colt handle the human friction, which he did with the particular patience of a man who'd spent years negotiating with people whose pride was more important to them than their self-interest. She stayed out of the social negotiation as much as she could. Not because she couldn't handle it, but because she'd decided that the most efficient use of her position was to be so obviously right about the technical questions that the other arguments didn't have enough air to breathe. By July, water was moving. Not everywhere, not perfectly. The main line to the Pruitt property had a pressure problem they spent 2 weeks diagnosing before Tessa found the miscalculated junction. But moving and reaching cattle in fields that had been running on prayer and stored rainwater for 8 months. The Red Mesa Creek was still low, still concerning, but the aquifer system gave the valley a redundancy it had never had, and that changed the weight of the drought from catastrophic to manageable. People were careful about giving Tessa credit in public. They found ways to phrase things that acknowledged the system without quite landing on who'd built it. The new wells was the common formulation. The water project. Colt noticed and said nothing about it at home, and Tessa noticed him noticing and also said nothing, because they'd both arrived independently at the conclusion that fighting for credit was a worse use of energy than building the thing that deserved credit. What shifted was subtler than public acknowledgement. It was the way Hector Salinas started stopping by the workshop with questions, not about saddles, but about his land, about the drainage on his north field, about whether the subsurface formation might extend further than the test well suggested. It was the way Pete Dunbar started sending people to her for advice on things that had nothing to do with leather. A fence post problem, a hay storage question. Small things that meant the category she'd been filed under, forgettable, unremarkable, had quietly started being revised without anyone formally announcing the revision. She didn't trust it entirely. Trust was a thing she extended on a lag, always waiting for the angle she hadn't seen, but she noted it. Vern Maddox came into the territory in August. Nobody knew that name yet in August. What they knew was that the Calloway brothers, who ran a small spread on the far western edge of the valley, had been visited by a group of armed men who'd delivered a message about water fees. The Calloways were a stubborn family with more pride than practical sense, and their response to the message had been a shotgun through the front window, which resulted in a burned equipment shed and one of the Calloway sons in bed for 2 weeks with a broken arm. The territory's law presence was a sheriff named Dawes who was competent in the ordinary way and completely unequipped for what was coming. He rode out to the Calloway place, took a report, sent a wire to the territorial marshal, and waited. The marshal's office sent a letter. The letter said they were aware of increased outlaw activity in the region and were monitoring the situation. Monitoring, Colt said when he read the copy Pete had shown around. They're monitoring it. From 300 miles away, Pete said. Word spread through July and into August. The armed group was moving through the valley systematically, hitting the smaller operations first. Water fees, they called it. Access fees to the creek tributaries that fed onto private land from the upper watershed. The logic was simple and brutal. They'd seized the high ground above the main water sources, both surface and what they claimed to know about the subsurface, and they were charging people to use water that had been those families' birthright for 2 and 3 generations. The name Vern Maddox surfaced in early August, passed from mouth to mouth the way bad information travels. Quietly, with a kind of reluctant gravity, like people were hoping that not saying it too loud might contain whatever it carried. Maddox had a history in the Southern Territories. He ran a crew of 12 to 15 men, organized enough to be difficult and unpredictable enough to be dangerous. He wasn't a random violence operation. Random violence drew too much attention and law response. He was methodical. He found communities with weak collective organization and drove wedges into the existing fractures. Red Mesa's fractures were not hard to find. The first demand came to the Mercer Ranch in late August, delivered by 2 men on horseback who tied up at the gate and sat waiting until Colt came out. One was doing the talking. The other was just there to make the arithmetic clear. Mr. Mercer, the talker said. He had a flat official manner, like a banker delivering bad news. Mr. Maddox extends his respects and wants you to know that water access in this valley is going to be managed differently going forward. The fee for a property your size is $40 a month. Colt stood at the gate with his hands at his sides. For what? For access to the watershed feeding your creek lines. My creek lines run from snowmelt on federal land. That's not private property. The roading infrastructure is being managed privately now, the man said. Any questions about the legal structure can be taken up with Mr. Maddox directly. Colt looked at the two of them for a long moment. Tell Maddox the answer is no, he said, and tell him the answer will be no every time he asks. The talker's expression didn't change. Mr. Maddox anticipated that response. He asked me to let you know that the infrastructure in question is quite fragile, and accidents happen in dry years. Ride out, Colt said. They rode out. He came back inside and found Tessa at the kitchen table, where she'd been able to see the whole exchange through the window. She had her notebook open in front of her, but she hadn't been writing in it. You heard, he said. Yes. He sat down across from her. We need to meet with the others, all of them. Wade too? Wade too. This is bigger than water rights and property lines. He looked at the table. Maddox picked this territory for a reason. He knows we're fractured. He's betting we can't hold together long enough to push back. Can we? He looked at her. That depends on what we have to offer them that matters more than the fear. She looked at her notebook. The maps inside it now included the distribution system, the full network of lines and junctions and aquifer access points across 7 properties, 4 months of work rendered in careful pencil on worn pages. She'd been meaning to make clean copies, but hadn't gotten around to it. I have an idea, she said. But you're not going to like the first part of it. Tell me. Maddox is controlling the surface water. The creek tributaries, the upper watershed, that's where his men are. He's betting that's the only water that matters. She tapped the notebook. He doesn't know about the aquifer system, or he doesn't know the full extent of it. Colt was quiet, following her. If the valley is genuinely independent of the surface water, she said, his leverage disappears. He can hold the creek lines all summer, and it won't matter. The system isn't complete enough yet. 3 properties still don't have aquifer access confirmed. I know. That's the part you won't like. She looked at him directly. We need to finish the drilling in the next 3 weeks. All 3 sites. While Maddox thinks he's in the process of tightening the grip, we cut the rope. 3 weeks for 3 additional wells and the distribution connections was aggressive to the point of being nearly impossible. Gaspar Reyes would have to be called back. Supplies would have to be sourced quickly in a territory where supply lines were already strained by drought conditions, and they'd have to do most of it without Maddox's people noticing that something was accelerating. He'll see the rig moving, Colt said. Not if it moves at night. He looked at her. The last 2 sites are within half a mile of each other on the Salinas property, she said. We run the rig out after dark, drill by lantern, have it back before morning. The 3rd site is on Pruitt land, further out, but there's a draw that screens it from the west road where Maddox's men are riding. That's 3 nights of work with a drilling rig and a crew in the dark. Yes. Someone gets hurt doing that. I know, she said. I know the risk, but the alternative is we finish this on Maddox's timeline, which means we don't finish it. He was quiet for a long time. She waited him out because she'd learned that his silences were processing, not avoidance. We'd need Gaspar willing, he said finally. Gaspar will do it if the money's right and he understands what it's for. He's not a man who likes being told where he can work. And Hector, and Pruitt. Yes, Pruitt's going to have conditions. Pruitt always has conditions. We meet them if they're reasonable and explain why if they're not. She paused. Colt, we have maybe 2 weeks before Maddox puts enough pressure on the smaller operations that they start paying. Once they start paying, the coalition breaks. This is the window. He looked at her with an expression she'd started to recognize over the past months. Not agreement exactly, but the specific look of a man who'd run someone else's analysis and found it matched his own. All right, he said. Set the meeting for tomorrow night. The meeting was at the Dunbar feed store again, but smaller this time. Colt, Tessa, Pete, Hector Salinas, Judge Pruitt, and a rancher named Frank Odell, who ran the 2 properties that still lacked confirmed aquifer access. Wade Whitmore was not invited, a decision Colt had made without consulting Tessa, but which she agreed with when she found out. Wade's instinct under pressure was to calculate personal advantage, and this meeting couldn't afford that variable. Tessa presented the plan. She drew the map on the back of a feed invoice, marking the 3 drilling sites, the screening terrain, the timeline. Nobody interrupted her, which was different from the April meeting at the same location, and she noticed the difference without commenting on it. When she finished, Frank Odell said, Night drilling. On my land. On your land and Hector's, she said. 2 nights at the Salinas sites, 1 at yours. If Maddox's people see a rig on my property, it's not an equipment shed that burns. Which is why we use the draw on the east side. His riders are on the west road, staying close to the creek lines. They're not watching the back terrain. She looked at him. But it's your land and your risk. I'm not going to tell you to take it. I'm telling you what I think the situation is. Frank looked at the map. He was a deliberate man, the kind who moves slowly through decisions and then stuck to them without reconsidering. What if Gaspar won't do it nights? He'll do it, Colt said. I talked to him this afternoon. Pruitt had been quiet through all of this, sitting with his hands folded. I want to be clear about the water rights structure once the additional sites are confirmed, he said. The existing agreements cover access, Tessa said. The distribution maintenance terms would need to be extended. I have draft language. She pulled a folded paper from inside the notebook and set it on the table. Pruitt looked at her, then at the paper, then picked it up. He read it with the focused attention of a man accustomed to reading for the clause that would cost him later, and his expression shifted incrementally towards something that wasn't approval but was adjacent to it. This is reasonable, he said, with mild surprise he didn't quite manage to hide. I tried to make it reasonable, she said. We need everyone to sign it, so it had to be. Pete said, Are we doing this? Hector Salinas said, Yes. He'd said almost nothing else all meeting. Frank Odell looked at the map again, then at Tessa. You're going to be out there those nights? Yes, she said. I know the sites. I know where the infrastructure connects. If something goes wrong with the drilling, I need to be there to make the call. He nodded, once, the way Hector had nodded at the well 3 months ago. A complete sentence compressed into a single motion. The first night went badly in the way that first nights of difficult operations always go. The rig bogged in soft ground 50 yards from the first site, and it took 2 hours and 8 men with timber to free it, which put them behind before they'd started. Gaspar drilled by lantern light with the economy of motion of someone who'd made peace long ago with working under bad conditions, and they hit the formation at 89 feet, deeper than Tessa had estimated, which meant the drill string had to be extended in the dark with cold hands and a timeline that had no margin. They were back before dawn by 40 minutes. Tessa slept 3 hours, then got up and checked the connection joints on the main line because she'd been thinking about the pressure differential in her sleep and wanted to confirm her calculation before the second night. The joint was slightly misaligned, a small thing that would have become a large thing in 6 months. She adjusted it and didn't tell anyone because it would have become a conversation about the overall reliability of the system, and she didn't have time for that conversation. The second night was cleaner. The third night, Frank Odell's property, the draw screening them from the road, was the one that almost went wrong. They were 40 minutes into drilling when Colt, who'd been watching the West Ridge, came back to where Tessa was standing by the equipment with his voice kept deliberately flat. 2 riders on the upper road, he said. They stopped. She looked at the rig. Gaspar was 12 feet down. Stopping now meant leaving casing in the hole, which meant the site was visible even if the rig moved. How far? She asked. 300 yards, maybe a little more. Can they see the light from there? Not if we cut it. He looked at her. But Gaspar can't drill in the dark. She thought for 4 seconds, which was all she had. Cut the lanterns. Tell Gaspar to stop the engine but hold position. We wait them out. The lights went out. The engine went quiet. The draw went dark enough that she couldn't see her own hands in front of her. They stood in the dark for 22 minutes. She counted because counting was something to do with her mind while the rest of her held still. Beside her, she could feel Colt's presence, not touching, just close. And that was... She noticed this even in the middle of being afraid. Steadying. The riders moved on. Gaspar started the engine again. They finished the site by 3 in the morning, and when the test flow came up, Tessa crouched in the dark by the collection point and put her hand in the water and felt the pressure of it and thought, there it is. That's the last one. We did it. She didn't say any of this. She stood up and told Gaspar to begin the casing and went to find Colt. He was at the ridge, still watching the road, and he didn't hear her coming until she was close. Done, she said. He turned. In the dark, she couldn't read his face properly, just the set of it, the relief in the shoulders. All three, producing. She looked out at the dark valley. Maddox doesn't have what he thinks he has. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were right. About all of it." "Don't say that yet," she said. "We still have to survive whatever he does when he finds out." She said it plainly because it was true, and because she didn't want either of them to relax into a conclusion that hadn't finished happening yet. But even as she said it, looking out at the dark land, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe ever. The particular bone-deep satisfaction of having been completely alone with the truth for years, and then watching that truth hold up against everything that tried to make it wrong. The valley was dark, and the road was empty, and under the dry ground, water moved in the direction she'd said it would move. Maddox found out 10 days later. Not through any particular failure of secrecy. The wells were in, the connections were made, and the work had been quiet enough that his riders hadn't flagged anything unusual. What he found out, through whatever network of informants he'd built into the valley's social fabric, was that the smaller ranches had stopped being afraid in the specific way they'd been afraid in August. That shift was harder to hide than a drilling rig. His response was to make an example. The Callaway place burned on a Tuesday night. Not just the equipment shed this time, but the main barn, and they lost 11 head of cattle that couldn't be gotten out in time. The family stood in the field at 2 a.m. and watched it go, and the eldest son, the one who'd had his arm broken in July, stood with his good arm around his mother and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. Word reached the Mercer Ranch by morning. Colt heard it from Pete, who'd ridden out himself rather than send someone, because Pete understood that this particular news needed to be delivered by a person who'd already processed what it meant. Tessa was in the workshop when Colt came to find her. She read it in his face before he said a word. "The Callaways," she said. "Barn and 11 head, families safe." She set down the tool she'd been holding. "He knows about the wells." "Maybe. Or he's sending a message regardless." Colt leaned against the doorframe. "Either way, it's the same next step. He's escalating because the fees aren't moving. How many of the ranchers will hold?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was being honest rather than reassuring. "Hector, Pete, Frank probably, Pruitt." He stopped. "Pruitt's going to look at that barn and do the calculation." She'd expected this. Pruitt was a practical man, and practical men in frightening situations calculated the cost of resistance against the cost of compliance, and sometimes the math didn't favor courage. "We need to get to him before Maddox does." "I know. I'm riding there this afternoon." "I'm coming." He looked at her, not with the refusal she half expected, but with the evaluating look that meant he was deciding whether her presence would help or complicate. "Pruitt respects the technical argument more than he respects most people," she said. "Let me make it." "All right." The Pruitt Ranch was 12 miles north, and they made it in an hour at a pace that wasn't comfortable but covered ground. Judge Pruitt met them on the porch, and he'd clearly been watching the road, which meant he'd already heard about the Callaways and had been expecting someone to come. He was a man of 60, heavy-set, with the kind of authority that came from 20 years of other people deferring to him. He looked at Colt first, then at Tessa, and then gestured them inside. His study was full of paper, legal documents, land surveys, correspondence, and he moved some aside to clear the table without apologizing for the disorder, which Tessa found mildly reassuring. Men who apologized for their disorder when under pressure were men managing appearances. Pruitt was just moving paper. "The Callaways," he said. He didn't frame it as a question. "Yes," Colt said. "That's a message about what holding out costs." "It is," Tessa said. "And it's also a mistake." Pruitt looked at her. "Maddox is controlling surface water," she said. "That's his entire leverage. If the Callaway barn was meant to frighten the valley into compliance, it worked on the wrong variable. The Callaways weren't part of the aquifer network. They're on the far western edge. They haven't confirmed access yet." She pulled her notebook from the satchel. "The properties that matter to his strategy are the 7 that are already on the distribution system. He needs at least 3 of us to break and pay before the others lose confidence. If none of those 7 break, he has nothing." Pruitt looked at the notebook but didn't reach for it. "He burned a barn." He burned a barn that wasn't connected to the system he's trying to break. It was a fear demonstration, not a tactical strike. She paused. If it were a tactical strike, he'd have come after the distribution infrastructure. He hasn't, which means either he doesn't know exactly where it runs, or he knows and he's not ready to move on it directly yet, Colt said. Because moving on it directly means armed confrontation with multiple property owners simultaneously, Tessa said. That's a different legal and logistical problem than burning one family's barn. Pruitt was quiet. He had the judge's habit of making his face reveal nothing while he processed, which made conversations with him feel like presenting arguments to a closed door. But he was listening. Tessa could see that. "What do you need from me?" he said finally. "Hold," Colt said. "Don't pay. Don't negotiate. And if Maddox's men come to this property, you send word immediately. And if they don't come to talk," the question sat in the room. "We've been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office again," Colt said. "The Callaway fire changes the legal status of this. That's criminal destruction, not a civil water dispute. The Marshal's office has more obligation to respond." Pruitt's expression suggested he found this moderately convincing and moderately insufficient. "The Marshal's office sent a letter last time." "I know, but the Callaway documentation is more substantial. Pete's already putting together an affidavit package." "The law takes time it doesn't always have," Pruitt said. He looked at Tessa. "You believe the infrastructure is the actual protection here, not the law." "The infrastructure removes his leverage," she said. "The law deals with the consequences of what he's already done. They're not the same thing, and we need both. But if I had to pick which one keeps this valley intact in the next 30 days, I'd pick the infrastructure." Another silence. Then Pruitt said, "I'll hold." He said it like a man closing a door on a room he wasn't sure he should close the door on. "But I want a communication arrangement. If something moves on my property, I need to be able to reach Colt within the hour." "Done," Colt said. "But Wade Whitmore paid Maddox on a Thursday." Nobody knew this for certain, but the pattern was unmistakable. The week after the Callaway fire, Maddox's riders stopped appearing on the roads adjacent to the Whitmore property. Stopped completely, which was a different behavior than they showed toward every other ranch in the valley. In a situation where every visible detail meant something, that absence meant something loud. Colt heard it from Pete on Saturday morning, and he didn't say anything about it until that evening, when he and Tessa were at the kitchen table with the distribution map spread between them, cross-checking the pressure readings from the week's monitoring. "Wade paid," he said. She didn't look up from the map. "I assumed." "We can't prove it." "We don't need to prove it to know it." She set her pencil down. "The question is whether anyone follows him." "Hector won't. Frank won't." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not sure about the Hendersons. They've been quiet." The Hendersons were a family on the southeast edge of the valley. Two brothers who ran a mid-sized cattle operation and had been present at the April meeting but silent at every subsequent one. Silence in a situation like this was usually fear rather than strategy. "I'll go see them," Tessa said. "You think they'll talk to you?" "I think they'll talk to anyone who comes in person instead of sending a rider with a message. They've been waiting for someone to show up and tell them it's going to be all right." She paused. "Which I can't do, honestly, but I can tell them what the actual situation is, which might be more useful." She rode to the Henderson place the next morning, alone, which she'd decided was better than coming with Colt, because two people arriving together had the weight of an official visit, and she wanted it to feel like a neighbor stopping by. The older Henderson brother, Dale, met her at the gate with the wariness of a man who'd been expecting bad news from every direction for weeks. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, in the tone of someone buying time. "Dale?" She dismounted. "I'm not here to ask you for anything. I just wanted to make sure you had the full picture of where things stand." He looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside from the gate. They sat on the porch, and she told him what she'd told Pruitt. The infrastructure argument, the leverage argument, the difference between what Maddox appeared to control and what he actually controlled. Dale Henderson listened with the focused attention of a man who'd been receiving information through rumor and fear for weeks, and was thirsty for something concrete. His younger brother came out partway through and sat on the porch steps and listened without introducing himself, which was his right on his own property, and Tessa let it be. When she finished, Dale said, "Wade Whitmore paid." "I believe so." "Wade's not a stupid man." "No," she said. "He's a man who calculated that paying was cheaper than holding. He might be right for his specific situation. I don't know his debt structure or his reserves." She looked at Dale. "I know your aquifer access is confirmed and producing. I know your property is in the middle of the distribution network, which means if Maddox wants to break the system, he has to come through you and 3 other properties simultaneously. That's a different risk calculation than he's been running so far." The younger brother said from the steps, "What happens if he decides to run it?" It was the first thing he'd said. Tessa looked at him. He was maybe 25, with the sunburned, slightly battered look of someone who'd been doing hard physical work since he was old enough to be useful. "Then we have a fight," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "How many of Maddox's men?" 12 to 15, best estimate." "Against what?" "Every rancher on the distribution network who holds. 7 properties. 15 men of our own if everyone commits." She paused. "Plus Colt." The younger Henderson looked at his brother. Something passed between them, the wordless communication of people who've lived in close proximity for a lifetime. Dale Henderson said, "We hold." Maddox made his move in the 3rd week of September, and the shape of it was not what anyone had expected. He didn't come at the distribution infrastructure directly, he came at the information about it. 2 of his men got to Gaspar Reyes's camp. Gaspar was still in the territory, working a legitimate contract 40 miles north, and spent an uncomfortable hour making clear to Gaspar that detailed knowledge of underground water infrastructure was a valuable commodity, and that Mr. Maddox would compensate him generously for maps, specifications, and depth data. Gaspar, to his credit, told them to leave his camp and then immediately sent a rider to the Mercer Ranch with a full account of the conversation. The rider arrived at 6 in the morning. Colt read the message at the kitchen table with Tessa across from him, and when he looked up, his face had the controlled quality of someone filing strong feelings in a place where they wouldn't interfere with clear thinking. "He's going for the infrastructure," Tessa said. "If he gets the maps, he knows exactly which junctions to hit to collapse the system." "Gaspar won't give him anything." "I know Gaspar won't. But Maddox doesn't know that Gaspar's told us, so he thinks he has time." She looked at the maps spread on the table. "We have maybe a week before he either gets what he needs from another source or decides to go at it without the detailed data. Then we move this week." She looked at him. "You want to go at them directly?" "I want to go at them while we still have the element of them not knowing what we know." He stood up. "I'm going to Pete's. Get everyone together. Can you draft the documentation we'd need for the marshal? The Callaway fire, the extortion demands, the approach to Gaspar?" "How fast?" "Today." She was already reaching for paper. "Go." She spent 4 hours at the table writing the affidavit documentation, precise, detailed, with dates and names, and the specific language of the demands as reported to her. She was not a lawyer, but she'd read enough of Pruitt's legal paperwork in the past months to understand what the language needed to do, which was make the pattern of behavior undeniable rather than just assertable. When she was done, she read it back once, changed 2 phrases that were imprecise, and set it aside. Then she sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a few minutes, because she'd been moving at a pace for 3 weeks that didn't leave much room for the fear she'd been managing alongside everything else, and she needed a moment to acknowledge that she was afraid. Not of the outcome exactly, more of the specific particular terror of having built something careful and watched someone try to destroy it. The aquifer system was 14 months of her life, and 2 years of her thinking before that, and the idea of it being targeted, of the junction points being destroyed, the lines being cut, the work being unmade, produced a feeling she didn't have a clean word for. She sat with it for 3 minutes, and then she put it away, because she had work to do. The meeting that evening was the largest they'd had, all 7 properties represented, plus Pete and Gaspar himself, who'd ridden down from the northern camp because Colt had sent for him personally. 12 people in the Dunbar feed store, and this time the air in the room was different from every previous meeting. Not calm, not frightened either. The particular focused seriousness of people who've run out of the option of waiting to see what happens. Colt laid out the situation plainly, and without theater. Maddox's approach to Gaspar. The likely timeline. The choice. We can wait for the marshal, he said. The documentation Tessa prepared is strong, but the marshal's timeline is not our timeline, and Maddox knows that. If we wait for law response, we're giving him the week he needs to move on the infrastructure. What's the alternative? Frank Odell said. We remove his ability to operate in this valley before he removes ours. Colt looked around the room. Coordinated. Every property. Same night. His riders have patterns. Pete's been tracking them for 3 weeks. We know where they camp and what roads they use. If we move together, we have the numbers. Men could get killed, Dale Henderson said. Not as an objection, as a fact that needed to be in the room. Yes, Colt said. I won't say otherwise. The room was quiet. Tessa looked at the faces around her. Pete's steady, Hector's still, Frank Odell's jaw set hard. Pruitt's closed as always, but present. Both Henderson brothers side by side with that familial mirroring, and thought about all the meetings that had happened in this building before she was invited to them, and about all the times the same people had talked around the actual problem instead of at it. I want to say something, she said. Heads turned. This plan works if we're unified and it falls apart if we're not, she said. One property holds back, one person loses nerve at the wrong moment, and the coordination breaks. So before we agree to this, I want everyone in this room to be honest, with the rest of us and with yourself, about whether you can hold your part. She let that sit. One by one, around the room, each man indicated he could hold his part, not with speeches. Pete said, I'm in. Hector nodded. Frank said, yes. Pruitt said, agreed. Both Hendersons. We're in. Gaspar from the corner. Tell me where you need the rig kept safe, and I'll keep it safe. Colt looked at Tessa. It wasn't a question. It was something else. A look between two people who'd been building something together long enough to recognize when the thing they'd built was about to be tested for real. She looked back at him and gave him the same thing she'd given him across a workbench 14 months ago, across a geological map in November, across a kitchen table in 100 early mornings since February, the steady, undecorated fact of where she stood. All right, Colt said. Saturday night, we moved together. The wind was up outside, rattling the feed store's east wall, and from somewhere across the valley, there was the sound of cattle moving, restless in the dark, the ordinary noise of a place that had been holding its breath for months and still hadn't let it out. Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of September night in the high plains where the stars look close enough to be a problem, too much light when you want darkness, and too much silence when you want noise to cover movement. They split into 4 groups at sundown. Colt led the eastern approach with Hector Salinas and 2 of Hector's ranch hands. Pete Dunbar took the road crew, himself, Frank Odell, and Dale Henderson's younger brother, whose name was Cal, and who had turned out, over the preceding week, to be exactly the kind of person you wanted in a situation like this. Someone who moved quietly, listened more than he talked, and didn't flinch at hard calculations. Pruitt stayed at his property with 2 armed men to hold the northern anchor. The Hendersons held the southeast. Tessa was with Colt's group, which had been a conversation that lasted about 40 seconds. You should stay at the ranch, he'd said that afternoon, not as a command, just as a position he was putting forward. The junction on the eastern line runs through the terrain we'll be moving through, she said. If they've already sent someone ahead to damage it, I need to be there to assess and repair. You don't know what to look for. He'd looked at her for a moment. You're not wrong about the junction. I know. You're also not wrong that I don't want you out there. She'd looked back at him with the particular steadiness she'd been cultivating since February, the kind that wasn't hardness, exactly, just the refusal to be moved by things that shouldn't move her. I know that too, she said. We're going anyway. They'd left it there. The plan was to converge on Maddox's primary camp, a disused homestead 3 miles west of the creek line that Pete's surveillance had confirmed as the operational base, simultaneously from 3 directions, with Pruitt's group holding the only northern exit road. Not a fight if it could be avoided. The goal was containment, surround the camp, deliver the message that the valley was no longer available as an operation, and make the cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving. It was the kind of plan that worked if the other side was rational and broke apart if they weren't, and nobody in the feed store on Thursday night had said this out loud, but everyone had understood it. Maddox turned out to be partially rational. When Colt's group came over the eastern ridge and the other groups emerged from the dark, on the other sides, and the camp found itself looking at 14 armed men from 3 directions. There was a long, bad moment, the kind of moment that has no script and depends entirely on what the next person decides to do with their hands. Vern Maddox was standing by the fire. He was shorter than the stories had suggested, a compact man in his 40s with a face that had taken some damage over the years, and wore it without apology. He looked at the surrounding men with the evaluating expression of someone running numbers, and the numbers were apparently coming out the same way they were coming out for everyone else. Because after about 15 seconds, he said to the man nearest him, "Stand down." Not all of his crew listened immediately. 2 of them looked at each other with the particular body language of men deciding whether to make a different choice. And it was Cal Henderson, young, quiet Cal, on the road crew with Pete, who stepped forward into the firelight and said, "Don't," in a voice that was so flat and certain that both men looked at him and then looked away and let their hands drop. It wasn't clean after that. It was the messy, logistically complicated process of disarming 13 men in the dark on uneven ground, with everybody's nerves running at a frequency that made every sudden movement feel like the start of something worse. One of Maddox's men ran for the North Road and hit Pruitt's line and was brought back, which took 20 minutes and covered nobody in dignity. Another one tried to negotiate in the way of someone who believes personal charm is a universal solvent, which it was not. Maddox himself said almost nothing through all of it. He stood at the fire and watched his operation being dismantled with an expression that was hard to read, not broken, not angry, something more resigned, the look of a man who'd run a calculation for the last time and arrived at a result he'd been expecting somewhere in the back of his mind. At one point, he looked directly at Tessa, who was standing at the edge of the firelight, having just confirmed the eastern junction was intact. His gaze was assessing rather than hostile. "You're the one who built the water system," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "That's what made the difference." Still not a question. "That's what made the difference," she agreed. He looked back at the fire. "I underestimated that." "Most people did," she said, and meant it without satisfaction, just as a statement of the thing that had been true for a long time. By midnight, Maddox's crew was disarmed and confined to the homestead under watch, and Pete had already dispatched a rider with the documentation package to the territorial marshal's office. The affidavits, the extortion records, the Callaway fire evidence, and now a first-hand account of the camp confrontation signed by 14 witnesses. The rider was also carrying a personal letter from Judge Pruitt, which, everyone agreed, would significantly improve the marshal's sense of urgency. The marshal arrived 4 days later. He was a lean man named Carver, who had the tired efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up too many situations that should have been prevented earlier, and he processed the scene and the evidence and the witnesses with minimal conversation and considerable paperwork. Maddox and 9 of his men were taken into custody. The remaining 4, who had enough legal distance from the direct extortion activity, were released with a formal warning and the understanding that Red Mesa territory had a long memory. Carver shook Colt's hand before he left. He shook Pete's hand. He nodded at Tessa, and then, after a moment, came back and shook her hand too, with the air of a man correcting an instinct he'd caught himself on. "The water infrastructure documentation was the strongest piece of the case," he said. "Clear demonstration of what his leverage was and how it was neutralized. Whoever prepared that knew what they were doing." "She prepared it," Colt said. Carver looked at Tessa. "Good work," he said. 2 words said plainly, and she took them the same way. Wade Whitmore's payment to Maddox came out 3 weeks later. It came out because Maddox, facing serious territorial charges, had begun negotiating with the marshal's office, and one of the things he traded was a full account of who in the valley had cooperated with his operation voluntarily. Wade was on the list. So was a business partner of Pruitt's named Giles, who had apparently calculated that helping Maddox maintain control of the water supply would create leverage he could use in a separate land dispute. The information moved through Red Mesa the way all information moved through Red Mesa, fast and somewhat distorted, gaining editorial additions at each relay. But the core of it was accurate and verifiable, and the community spent 2 weeks processing the fact that the men who'd positioned themselves as voices of pragmatism and community leadership had been quietly helping the person threatening the community. Wade didn't leave town. That was the thing Tessa hadn't expected. She'd assumed he'd find a reason to be elsewhere while the information circulated. But he stayed, and she saw him twice at the dry goods store in October, and both times he looked like a man carrying something he hadn't found a place to set down. She didn't speak to him either time. There was nothing she wanted to say, and she didn't trust herself to say it cleanly if she tried. Cecily came to the workshop in the second week of October. She came alone, same as January, but the quality of the aloneness was different. Not purposeful in the way a mission makes a person purposeful, just a woman who decided to come and had come. She stood in the doorway and looked at Tessa at the bench and said, "I wanted to say something." "All right," Tessa said. She kept her hands still on the leather. Not working, just still. "My father made a bad choice," Cecily said. "I knew something was wrong in August when the riders stopped coming by our place, but I didn't say anything." She stopped. "I don't know if I could have changed anything, but I knew something was wrong, and I said nothing." Tessa looked at her. The woman across the workshop was 23 years old and had been prepared her whole life to be useful in a way that the world had just demonstrated was more complicated than the preparation allowed for. That wasn't Cecily's fault. It wasn't not her fault either. It was the tangled situation of people who've been handed a map to a place that doesn't exist exactly as drawn. "You're not your father," Tessa said. "I know that." A pause. "I'm not sure that's enough, though." "No," Tessa agreed. "It's a start, not an end." Cecily looked at the bench, at the saddle Tessa had been working on. "I want to learn," she said. "Something, anything that's actually useful." She said the last part with a slight roughness, the frustrated edge of someone who'd spent years acquiring skills that turned out not to matter when it counted. I don't know what that means yet, but I wanted to say it to someone who'd understand what I meant." Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come back Thursday. I'll show you how to read a drainage map." Cecily looked at her. "It's where I started," Tessa said. "It's not nothing." The public gathering was in November, in the open field behind the feed store, because the building wouldn't hold everyone who showed up. It was Pete's idea, and Pete's organization, and Pete's stubbornness that got it done despite 3 people telling him it was too cold for an outdoor gathering, and 1 person telling him the valley didn't go in for ceremony. Pete's response to all of this was that the valley could stand to develop some new habits, and he moved forward. They built a fire, several of them, and set up benches, and more people came than anyone had predicted. Not just the ranchers and their families, but the townspeople, the dry goods owner, the justice of the peace who'd married Colt and Tessa in February, Pete's daughter May, Gaspar Reyes who'd driven down from the Northern Territory specifically for the occasion. There were speeches, which were the usual length and quality of speeches at community gatherings, which is to say some of them were necessary and some of them ran long. Hector Salinas said 11 words. We held because we knew what we were holding for. This was the best speech of the evening. Colt spoke, and he was direct in the way he was always direct. No ornamentation, just the sequence of events and what they meant, and the acknowledgement at the end that the strategy that had worked was not his strategy. I want to say something plainly, he said, standing at the edge of the firelight with the whole gathered valley in front of him. The water system that broke Maddox's leverage was built by one person over 2 years, mostly alone, with no support and no particular reason to believe anyone would ever listen. The documentation that put him in front of a judge was written in one afternoon by the same person. The plan that we all carried out on a Saturday night was that person's plan. He paused. I picked a wife that this community told me was the wrong choice. I want everyone here to sit with what that tells you about this community's judgment. He sat down. Tessa, beside him on the bench, didn't look at him, but her shoulder was against his shoulder, and she left it there. People looked at her. Not the way they'd looked at her in January, not the uncomfortable, calculating look of people reassigning a social category, but directly. A few people she didn't know well came and said things that were honest and brief. Hector nodded at her from across the fire. May Dunbar squeezed her arm. Gaspar Reyes said, You read that land correctly, and then went and got coffee, because Gaspar expressed admiration the same way he expressed everything else. Cecily Whitmore was there, slightly apart from her family, and when her eyes met Tessa's across the fire, she gave a small nod that said something specific. I'm here, I came, I'm paying attention. Tessa nodded back. She didn't give a speech. Nobody formally asked her to, and she didn't volunteer. What she'd wanted to say, she'd mostly said in meeting rooms and on paper and in 2 years of notebook pages that had turned out to be right. Public speeches felt like a different kind of work that she wasn't sure was hers to do. But afterward, standing at the edge of the gathering while people moved toward the food and the fire and the ordinary human project of finding something warm to eat on a cold night, Pete came and stood beside her. You should know, he said, that 3 families have come to me in the past week asking about aquifer assessment on their properties. And the Henderson boy, Cal, wants to know if you'd be willing to teach him what you know about subsurface mapping. She looked at the fire. Cal's got a good eye. He does. Pete looked at her sideways. You going to take him on? And Cecily Whitmore, she said. Pete's eyebrows moved slightly. That's an interesting choice. She's got nothing to do with her father's choices, Tessa said. And she wants to learn something real. That's enough for me. Pete was quiet for a moment, looking at the gathering, at the fire, at the people talking and moving and existing in the way of a community that had been through something and come out on the other side changed in the specific way that surviving changes people. Not triumphant, not untouched, just different, harder in some places and looser in others, reconfigured. You know, Pete said, my father used to say that the worst thing about people is that they need proof before they'll believe something they should have been able to see. And the second worst thing is that once they have the proof, they'll act like they believed it all along. Tessa thought about that. The second thing doesn't bother me as much as it used to, she said. No? People adjusting their position when the evidence changes is actually what you want them to do. She looked at the gathering. It's slow, and it's irritating, and it comes too late half the time. But it's not nothing. Pete made a sound that was his version of agreement. Colt came to find her a few minutes later, coming through the crowd with 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one, and stood beside her looking at the same fire. He didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things she'd come to value about him. The absence of the need to fill silence with words that didn't add to it. After a while she said, You didn't have to say what you said up there. I know. People are going to talk about you saying it. People talk regardless. You told me that yourself. She looked at the side of his face, the familiar angles of it, the particular quality of his attention that was always directed outward, at the thing in front of him, rather than at the impression he was making. She thought about the January afternoon he'd come to her workshop with harness straps that didn't need fixing, and the November visit with the geological maps, and the February morning in the cold light outside a barn that needed a new roof, shaking hands on something that neither of them had language for yet. She still didn't have perfect language for it. She thought she probably never would, and that was fine, because the thing itself didn't require a label to be what it was. Thank you, she said. He looked at her. For what, specifically? For coming back with those harness straps, she said. You didn't have to do that either. Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, but the predecessor to one. The expression that forms when a person recognizes something they've been thinking about for a long time being named aloud. Best decision I made that year, he said. Second best, she said. The geological assessment was the best. He laughed. It was a real one, short and unguarded, and it surprised her still, the way it always did, that a man who wore his face so carefully had a laugh that was entirely undefended. The fire burned on. The valley gathered around it, imperfect and fractured and rebuilt, held together not by the things that were supposed to hold communities together, not by old money or old names or carefully arranged alliances, but by water, of all things. By the stubborn fact of water under dry ground that one woman had spent 2 years looking for while everyone else was looking at her and seeing nothing. That was the thing about Red Mesa territory, about this particular stretch of hard plains between 2 mountain ranges. It sorted people into 2 categories, those it broke and those it made harder. But Tessa Hale had found a 3rd category, the one nobody talked about because it was rarer and harder to see, the ones it taught. She'd listened to the land when no one was listening to her, and the land had told her the truth, and she'd held that truth alone until she was ready to make the world hold it too. That wasn't strength in the way the territory usually defined strength. Not muscle, not firepower, not the willingness to be the loudest person in the room. It was the harder, quieter thing, the refusal to stop being right just because no one had confirmed it yet. The drought broke in December. Slow at first, then the rains came in the way they sometimes do after a long absence, with the excessive generosity of something that has been withholding. The Red Mesa Creek ran full by January. The aquifer system, already established, turned from emergency infrastructure into permanent foundation, the thing the valley would build on for the next generation. The reason 3 families would confirm subsurface water on their properties the following spring. The reason Cal Henderson would teach his own children, years later, how to read a drainage map. Tessa's 40 acres got its new roof on the barn in the spring. Not her father's barn anymore, just land she owned with water under it, an option she hadn't had before. She kept the workshop there. It was the place she'd started, and she saw no reason to leave it behind. She was not the person Red Mesa had expected her to be. She was never going to be easy to categorize or comfortable to overlook, and she had stopped trying to be either. The town that had sorted her as forgettable had been shown, at considerable cost to itself, that the thing it had filed away without looking was the most important thing it had. People rarely learned that lesson once and kept it. She knew that. She watched Cecily Whitmore bent over a drainage map on a Thursday afternoon in the workshop, her careful handwriting copying the notation system, her face showing the particular concentration of someone who has finally found a problem that requires her full attention, and thought, this is how it carries forward. Not in speeches and gatherings and formal acknowledgments, though those had their place, in the specific transferable knowledge that one person hands to another and says, here is how you read the ground, here is how you listen for the thing underneath. The land held its water and its silence, and below it, deeper than most people thought to look, things moved in the direction Tessa had said they would move. That was enough. That had always been enough. It had just taken a while for anyone else to see it.